Thanks everyone for coming to the conference today. So Alison and I are just going to give a sort of initial introduction to the day and where this conference is sort of stemmed from, and then we'll just give you a bit of housekeeping information as well. So we're a bit behind schedule, but I think it's fine. We can be a bit flexible with the timings that we've got anyway. So yes, this is obviously the title of our project and the conference, Mental Health, Education and the Humanities. So we thought we might just start by saying a little bit about ourselves, because although some of you may know us, not everyone will. So Alison, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I'm Alison Brady. I'm a lecturer at UCL, the Institute of Education. Oh, it's not called that anymore actually, it's called the Faculty of Education and Society. And I guess my interests are in philosophy of education, specifically existential philosophy, and using that as a lens to understand teaching and learning and different aspects of education. So obviously, if you know anything about existential philosophy, it lends itself quite well, I think, to mental health education. I'm also quite interested in the intersection between philosophy, literature and education. I'm writing a book on that at the moment. So really excited to be here.
Great, and I am Emma Williams. I'm an associate professor in education at Warwick University, and yeah, like Alison, I am working mainly in the field of philosophy of education. So I will say a little bit about what has prompted the conference today, and it has kind of stemmed from a grant that I received from the British Academy in 2019, so actually quite a long time ago now, which was focused on exploring the role of philosophy in developing a kind of wider understanding of mental health amongst adolescents in secondary schools. So this idea of a kind of mental health literacy, which was starting to be introduced into education around, much earlier than this, but in 2018, 2019 in particular, there was a lot of discussion around this topic. So I actually received this grant just before the pandemic hit, and then the initial version of this conference was scheduled to happen that summer, but because of COVID, it was cancelled. So the project went ahead, and actually now the conference is happening at a time when the project is sort of coming to its end in that initial pilot version. So I think it's actually worked out quite well, because we have a chance to reflect back on that project and to see, what the next steps will be for it. The idea behind focusing on philosophy was really to think a bit whether we can think in different ways about how mental health is being taught in schools. And the kind of main focus for that British Academy project was to look at the way that philosophy might help us to think, talk and educate differently about mental health. So these were the project questions that were sort of framing that body of work. In what ways is philosophy a way of promoting wider understanding of mental health? And also within that project, I was looking at translating those more conceptual ideas about the relationship between philosophy and mental health into something practical for young people, and came up with this idea to create a podcast series aimed at sort of adolescents, young people, that would introduce a sort of philosophical approach to mental health to them. So part of the project was also, as well as being kind of research theoretical project, it was also looking at a more practical, applied dimension to explore whether these theoretical ideas about philosophy could translate into something meaningful for young people today. So yeah, this is the sort of approaches behind the project more broadly. Conceptually, as I say, kind of exploring and mapping that relationship between mental health and its connection to education. Using philosophical literature to examine and sort of challenge some of the more predominant ideas about mental health and the therapeutic approaches that were predominant and are predominant within education. And as I say, also this idea of putting things into practice. So creating a podcast series and then doing some work with young people to see what their reactions were to hearing about a philosophical approach to mental health, which Alison's going to say a bit more about. But yeah, I suppose the underpinning ideas, like what kind of motivated me to get into this project in the first place, I think was the perception that although there was much talk about this crisis in mental health, or a crisis in mental health amongst young people, that phenomena itself raises some philosophical questions, but these aren't often being looked at in educational discussions around mental health. And I suppose coming from a philosophy background, also the interest in whether exploring those philosophical issues might actually help us to make better sense of the mental health crisis amongst young people, and also make better sense of the kinds of responses in education that it might call for. So, as well as being centred around philosophy, the project also really wanted to take a kind of interdisciplinary approach to thinking about these alternative ways of understanding mental health. So although it does seek very much to display the kind of richness of philosophy as a discipline, it's not kind of taking philosophy in a very purist kind of way. It's interested in the connections between philosophy and literature, as Alison said. This draws on our academic background, philosophy and psychoanalysis, philosophy and therapy. So it's aiming to kind of be a bit more interdisciplinary in exploring these wider philosophical questions and issues raised by the mental health crisis. So seeking to build connections as well as to look at the contrasts between philosophical approaches and those of psychology, medicine and therapeutic disciplines. I think as probably an outcome of the project in some ways, it's also dovetailed with the question of the humanities in education and debates about the kind of crisis of the humanities and the situation that humanities subjects are in within educational institutions today. So I think as a sort of, this wasn't necessarily an intention of the original project, but it seems that the discussion about the role of the philosophy and the humanities in addressing mental health has also kind of dovetailed with that question about, well, what's the status of the humanities and to what extent are the current systems of education inhospitable to humanities, ways of thinking and ways of understanding the world. Okay, so I'm just handing over to Alison now.
Yeah, thank you. So I just thought I'd give a quick sort of overview of the project so far and what we've done so far, because as Emma said, this conference is coming sort of at the end of the wider project. So just to give you a sense of what we've been doing. So about a year ago, we were part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. And during this time, we ran a series of workshops with students in A-levels. The idea was to expose them to some episodes of Disquieted Life, which was the podcast that that Emma made. And the idea is that they would listen to these, and then there would be a short exercise that they would complete, a written exercise, which we would then look at prior to the session, and then we would kind of go through some of their responses, pick out some themes that we thought were related to the kind of wider project that we were doing. We also, as part of that workshop, did some role-playing exercises where the students would take on different roles in terms of how you might respond to specific mental health crises or mental health issues. And it was quite interesting to see what kind of responses they come up with. So some of the responses that they had, this is in the exercise prior to the actual workshop itself, they often made sort of statements speaking to the correlations between physical and mental health, and how these are often sometimes conflated, specifically within wider sort of society, wider public discourse, but also within their education as well, and the kind of educational responses that they had experience with in terms of mental health. So one of the students, these are all pseudonyms of course, talked about how if somebody broke their foot, it would make sense to put a cast on it to fix it. But in terms of mental health, you cannot put a plaster on a heart, which I just thought was quite nice. So obviously speaking to some of the distinctions between physical and mental health, and we kind of use that sort of distinction as a springboard to really think about, okay, what are the differences? What is it about mental health that is so distinct from physical ailments, for example? They also talked about what we sort of thought of as the kind of medicalized responses to mental health, again, that they experienced in their education, so the kind of educational responses that they had, as well as just in general public discourse. And some of them talked about this idea that the kind of medicalized responses had these sort of formulated or pre-formulated responses, and what they were more interested in, or what philosophy was helping them do, was to think about developing a different language for speaking about their specific problems with mental health, or the specific experiences that they had that we might conventionally refer to as sort of mental health issues. So that was really interesting. We also did work, as part of the workshop, we did this role-playing activity, so we gave them 2 examples of, obviously this is coming from a mid-30s academic, imagining what kinds of experiences a young person might have, so probably a little bit out of touch. But the idea is that they would look at these sort of examples, and they would think about, okay, as somebody coming from a kind of psychiatric background or a medical background, how would you respond to this? Somebody coming from a philosophical background, how would you respond to this? And again, it was quite interesting, the responses that they sort of came up with. So in terms of the first scenario, they talked about the psychiatrist as being more concerned maybe with rewards in terms of motivating behaviors. So the kind of behaviorist sort of model of psychology, that again was something they were familiar with in the responses that they had to mental health so far. And they made some interesting comments about how the philosophical approach might be distinct from that, in terms of thinking about sort of wider questions around the good society, the good life, how that plays into the way that we respond to mental health, and also indeed the way that we conceptualize mental health as well. In the second scenario, again, they kind of picked up on how the psychiatrists might have a more sort of diagnostic approach, tend to be maybe a little bit individualistic, helping them get over bad habits in a sense, whereas the philosopher might maybe draw connections amongst people in terms of their responses to these situations, maybe try to say something a little bit more universal about how, in a sense, we all have these kinds of experiences, we all think of ourselves in terms of others, how we understand ourselves is very much tied to how other people recognize and see us. So again, really interesting responses, I think, that were coming out of this. And of course, the students were not denigrating one response over another. They were merely just talking about how these responses, in a sense, are different. And I think that really tied into part of what we were thinking about, the differences between these 2 approaches as well. And then later on, so in July, we did 2 focus group sessions with Year 12 students, unfortunately over Zoom because it was COVID time. And again, they had a pre-activity task, and we had a sort of really nice discussion taking place as well. So I just wanted to show you some of the transcripts from that, so you just get a sense of the kinds of things that we were talking about. So again, very similar themes, so this connection between physical and mental illness, and how these 2 things are distinct, or in what sense are they distinct. That was quite something that came up quite often. Another thing that we often talked about in those focus groups was the specific school responses to mental health. So one of the participants talked about this idea that the school would, in a sense, push this idea that you can sort of meditate for 5 minutes a day, and that would give you enough mental clarity to get through the day. And actually, the best kinds of responses that they had to mental health crises were found in the kind of conversations that they had with their friend groups, as opposed to the sort of school-based responses, which was quite interesting. Another participant talked about how the school only seemed to be particularly concerned about mental health around the time of exam week. So there was something there about sort of instrumentalizing responses to mental health in order to sort of continue the juggernaut of schools, you could say, in a sense. So that also was something that we discussed. And then finally, because prior to this focus group, they listened to the podcasts, particularly the one that was based on Stanley Cavell with Paul Standish, who's here. And again, we were trying to think through, okay, what would a philosophical response mean to you? What would that actually look like? And in what sense might it be helpful for you in maybe thinking about mental health in a different way? And again, we got some really interesting responses in terms of maybe philosophy being more about a sort of everyday understanding of mental health versus a very sort of specialized version of mental health crises that you might find in other disciplines. We also had a really interesting response from one participant who talked about the value of literature and books in sort of helping her navigate some of the difficulties that she might be having in school, for example, which again was quite interesting and quite enlightening for us to see. And then finally, I guess the last thing that we thought was particularly interesting that came up in these conversations was around this conception of making sense, and how that's obviously in a sense very tied to mental health responses. So one of the participants quoted Cavell, this idea of the desire for sanity could drive one mad, and sort of interpreting that in terms of rationalizing how we feel and how that can often be quite challenging, quite difficult, but also in some ways a common response to particular mental health issues that somebody might be facing. And there was also this sense of maybe certainty that comes with making sense or with rationalizing the ways that we feel, providing some kind of comfort to us in that sense. So again, I think a lot of the conversations that we were having in those focus groups really did map onto a lot of the themes that we've been discussing in the project at large. So we're hoping to do something with that in the future. So yeah.
That's Thanks, Alison. That's great. So kind of complementing the empirical research, we might say. We're not empirical researchers,
Yes.
as you may have been able to tell, we're philosophers, but we, did some empirical research. Also, we sort of wanted to explore these issues in a more kind of philosophical way. The podcast series that the students listened to as part of the focus groups that we carried out were all informed by different people that we think would take a philosophical approach to mental health. So there was a podcast on Freud, which I think I shared with you guys to listen to for some discussion this afternoon. There was also one on the philosopher Stanley Cavell and one on Shakespeare. So they were obviously going back to that interdisciplinary approach that I was mentioning at the start. These were obviously thinkers coming from different fields, but we were seeing similar themes emerging within their thoughts, or similar ways of reading these the thoughts of these individuals in relation to how they are relevant to the discussions about mental health. So there were various kind of philosophical questions, I suppose, that were coming out of the discussions on the podcasts and then in the broader research, including questions about the relationship between language and thought, conceptions of health and cure, and at a really fundamental level, conceptions of what it is to be human and what the human condition is like. And this quote from Samuel Beckett, I forgot to put his name on there, "You're on Earth, there's no cure for that," was a sort of quote that underpinned all of those podcast episodes, and in different ways we looked at how Freud, Cavell, Shakespeare might help us to kind of make sense of the lesson in that in relation to mental health. So just to flag up a publication that arose from this project and was published in April this year. All of the speakers today were also contributors to this collection. So it was a special issue of the Journal of Philosophy of Education on philosophy, mental health and education. So that was a collection that brought together people interested in working on mental health in various disciplines, including philosophy, but also psychology and psychiatry, psychoanalysis, literature, and the arts as well. So quite a interdisciplinary mix in that special issue. But again, everyone's sort of exploring in different ways how we might problematise the current approaches to mental health in education, and not just from a critical perspective, but also think how we could improve or maybe respond in different ways to mental health in education. So this is just sort of segueing us then into today, because as Alison has mentioned from the focus groups and in the research and the special issue, there were a number of kind of emerging themes and areas of interest which we're hoping to take forward now in a different in a further project. So Alison's already touched on this a little bit in relation to the student who mentioned the mental health classes in exam week. But within the special issue as well, there are many papers that touch on this issue of the therapy culture in education and in broader society. The kind of therapeutic turn which is seen to have happened in education over the last decades. And I suppose behind that, a kind of critique of how, or implicit critique of how that particular model of therapy seems to work very well within the current educational system that we're within. So whether in some ways education is kind of contributing to mental health issues, and whether the predominant responses to that in education are tending to just sort of reinforce the educational system rather than recognise the sort of deeper pathologies that might be there in education itself. So that was definitely a theme that we felt came out a lot from the special issue and was something we could explore further, and I think maybe will be explored further in some of the talks today. And as well as that, as I mentioned before, the idea of the crisis in the humanities, because I think this, from an educational perspective, this wider debate fits very well into that, alongside that, the question of the therapy culture, because humanities ways of thinking being under threat in education today. What is it about the current approaches to education that disallow or make for an inhospitable climate for humanities, and is it incidental that there is this decline in the humanities at a time when there's a rise in mental health crises amongst young people? So I think obviously the humanities are not explored currently as much as other approaches to therapy in education. So this is what gave us the idea for our conference today, was to kind of bring some of these thoughts together and explore how we can learn from the humanities about what mental health is, the nature of mental health, how we can learn from other disciplines about the connections between the humanities approaches and maybe those of psychology, therapy, medicine, so other approaches that may be sort of challenging the more predominant picture of mental health in society and education within these fields as well as within the humanities. And also to think about how we could, or whether we should give more priority to humanities approaches in schools' mental health agenda at present. So these are, I suppose, the broader questions that are standing behind the conference today, and hopefully we will have some chance at the end of the day to reflect on where we think we might have got to with them. Okay, great.